Hey guys, in this series Mariano5 and myself are going to discuss 10 very common leaks we've spotted over the thousands of combined hours we've played at the live cash games, along with what we can do to avoid them and immediately increase our win rate.
Yeah, that's right, and we're also excited to announce that we have an entire Raise Your Edge course coming out in early 2019, which is focused solely on crushing the live games. In the course, we'll be expanding on all the concepts in the series, plus everything else you'll need to be successful at the live felt. But for now, let's get into the leaks. Here we have leak number 7, calling flop bets too wide multi-way. Now, this is something you see all the time in these games. Players catch any type of piece and they want to try to chase it down to the turn in the river, see if they can improve. But as a general rule, we want to try to be the aggressor in these games and not the chaser. I realize this is obviously a very broad statement, and there's going to be plenty of times where we're the one chasing the draws and calling with maybe some mediocre value hands trying to improve, but I just mean as a general overall strategy, we want to be the one who's applying pressure and not the one who's constantly chasing. And when we're talking about calling flop bets too wide, we are referring to both draws and value hands, so keep this in mind. Now, for starters, it's never going to be a problem getting away from marginal spots early on in the hand, because the problem people run into is that they end up getting attached to their hand on later streets. It's somewhat of a sunk cost fallacy. You feel like you've invested a bunch of money, and then you get to the river and you start justifying reasons to call down. By now the pot is super big, so any mistake you make is magnified as well. Maybe you start assigning your opponents a wide bluffing range just to justify the call, when in reality they aren't bluffing much at all. So it's very easy to have happen, and you really need to watch out for this. Another major factor is that there's a ton of reverse odds in play, so if you're calling with weak hands on the flop, many times even if you hit, even if you improve, you're still going to run into better hands. This is especially true multi-way. This is also true with weak draws, so you see it all the time where players chase down super weak flush draws in massive pots, or maybe some weak straight draws, and they end up with the bottom end of it, and they end up losing these huge pots and whining about how unlucky they get. But that's just the reality. If you're chasing weak draws, you're going to end up with weak mate hands, and this is also another reason why we want to focus on playing solid ranges pre-flop. We can definitely avoid all of this. And then lastly, it's going to cause us to be easily punished by the good players at the table. Once they know that we're calling flop bets too wide, they're going to understand that our turn ranges are very wide and weak, which is going to allow them to barrel us off really often, even with marginal holdings, and there's nothing we can do about it. So they're definitely going to be able to make a lot of money off us long term. Now we can check out a couple of example hands here. Playing in a 1-3 game here, and ABC regular comes in for the raise from early position. Couple calls. We call on the button, of course. Our hand has great playability, and we have position. Whale comes along in the small blind, so 5-way to the flop. We flop second pair with a decent kicker. ABC reg bets out now. We can certainly assume that he's betting a very strong range here, because he is betting into 4 people, and the board is very wet, and he's also on a very strong range pre-flop when he comes in raising from early position, so he's definitely not betting with hands like pocket 10s, pocket 8s, 6x, weak draws. He'll certainly be on a pretty reasonable range here. Now, the tight passive player calls. We can assume he's on a strong range as well, because he is a tight passive player, so we can assume he's got a lot of queen x, maybe some strong jack x, and other strong draws. But it's on us on the button now, and we are getting a pretty good price here. 3.6 to 1. We do have a pair. Maybe we can improve on the turn and river and win a big pot, so we flick in the call. But if we have a closer look here, it's definitely a spot where we can just go ahead and fold on the flop, because if we do hit the 9, players can definitely have king 10 still, and there's obviously the clubs out as well. If the 9 of clubs hits, somebody could have a flush. And just also, if we hit the 9 and a bunch of money goes in, we can easily be up against hands like queen jack suited, pocket queens, pocket 6s. So we really don't have very good implied odds, and there's actually quite a decent amount of reverse implied odds if the pot does get big here. So it's going to be totally fine instead to just make a tight fold and get away early. Next up we have a 2-5 hand, and loose passive player comes in from early position with the raise. We can definitely assume he's on a strong range here because these type of players love to limp in. So when they do in fact raise, especially from early position, they're going to have good hands. 3 calls in position there from behind, and now it's back on us in the big blind. We're getting almost 6 to 1. We have a great drawing hand, great suited connectors, so very easy to defend for us here. See a flop, and we do flop the open ender. Check it over, and now the loose passive player comes out betting 90. So very strong bet here, especially because he's passive. He's going to have a very strong range. Now the tight passive player makes the call, and we can assume that he's on a very strong range now, calling such a big bet. Loose passive player number 2 on the button calls. He can definitely have a wider range, of course. He can have some ace-x, maybe even 10x, or maybe even some 9x, because he is loose. He can also have some draws. Of course, all 3 of these players can have flush draws, and also hands like queen-jack. So it's back on us, and we're getting a little bit over 4 to 1 here. And we figure if we hit our hand, we're going to win a huge pot. We have a decent draw, so we go ahead and make the call. But if we have a closer look here, there's actually a few reasons why calling here is not necessarily going to be too good. The first reason is that not all of our outs are going to be clean, so if the 6 of spades hits or the jack of spades hits, there's going to be a decent chance that somebody's also made their flush, in which case we're going to lose a big pot. Even if an offsuit jack hits, there's a decent chance somebody could have king-queen. Somebody could definitely have a hand like king-queen of hearts here, or maybe king of spades, queen x, or maybe even just the offsuit king-queen. The loose passive player on the button could be making a loose call here with a gut shot, so that's always out there as well. And another big reason is that because the loose passive player is on such a strong range, he's going to be shoving the turn or betting big enough to put us all in very often, so we're not going to be able to see the river very often here as well. And if we can only see one card, let's say we have 5 or 6 outs, the chance of hitting that's going to be somewhere around 10%, so it's going to be very tough to hit our hand anyways. We're also out of position here, so that makes things a bit tougher as well. And then lastly, we're not very deep stacked. We started the hand with about 100 big blinds, so there's really not great implied odds here. I mean, there is some money in the pot, and we do have about 400 behind, so it's okay, but it'd be much better if we were sitting on, say, 800 to 1,000 effective stack. That would make things much more enticing to try to draw to the offsuit 6 or jack. But here, because of all those reasons, it's totally fine just to fold this draw. You don't need to chase every draw. You're going to find much better spots in these games where you're both deeper stacked and in position, and maybe you have the initiative as well, so all in all, this really isn't that good of a spot, and we can definitely make the tight fold and move on to the next hand. Alright, so looking at a solution now, what are some of the main things we want to be thinking about when we are facing these decisions? You can almost think of this as a mental checklist that you want to go through at the table, so don't worry about taking your time with decisions. It's very important. If you act too fast, it's going to lead to a ton of mistakes. So you definitely want to avoid this for starters. The first thing we always want to be doing is to assign realistic ranges to our opponents as best we can. Now I have the realistic here in bold because it's such an important concept. A lot of players will tend to assign their opponents really unrealistic ranges in a ton of spots in order to justify making bad calls and just bad plays overall. But if you're serious about making money in poker and improving, you have to get over this. You have to be honest with yourself and really try your best to assign them realistic ranges. It's the only way. Now to do so, we want to be using any pre-flop or post-flop actions or tendencies that we've seen from these players. So this can be obviously from previous hands or even from the hand at play. We want to be thinking about what positions they're in, what type of players they are. Then we can kind of get an idea of what type of ranges they're going to be on. Once we have an idea of this, we want to be paying close attention to how clean our outs are if we are in fact going to call on the flop. So is there a flush draw present, as we saw in the hand examples? This is obviously going to decrease our outs quite a lot, especially if it's multi-way. You need to be very careful in the spot. We also need to be very aware that even if we hit, players can definitely have stronger 2 pairs or straights or flushes or whatever the hand may be. We need to be realistic about what they might already have on the flop or what they might be drawn to as well, and really try to put the picture together. We also need to pay close attention to our realistic implied odds. So as an example here, let's say we're in a spot where we have pocket sixes, we're out of position and the board is 7, 8, 9 rainbow. It's a multi-way spot, maybe the pre-flop raiser bets, there's a couple callers here, we're facing a pretty sizable bet. Now if we think about our implied odds in this spot, we have the sixes, we have the bottom end of the straight, so right away if the 10 hits, there's going to be some reverse implied odds. So that goes up to my previous point about how clean our outs are. In that case, somebody could definitely have the jack, so we need to be careful on that. And then if a 5 hits, if we're playing against good players, are they realistically going to be paying off big bets on later streets when there's 4 cards to a straight out? Probably not, right? So in this type of spot, you really don't have a ton of implied odds, and we're also out of position, making it even harder. The same thing goes if we hit our 6. That can definitely give somebody a straight with a 10 or a 5. So it's really not going to be a good spot. However, if we have a look at a different example now, we have 5-4 suited, and we're in position this time on Ace-Jack-3 rainbow, and we're playing against a couple weaker players. This spot's going to have way higher implied odds than the pocket sixes spot for a couple of reasons. The first is that if we do hit the 2, our draw is very disguised, so it's going to be tough to put us on the 5-4 suited here. There's also going to be no reverse implied odds. If we do hit the 2, because the board is rainbow, we're going to have the absolute nuts on the turn, so it's going to be pretty easy to play. There's also the fact that we're up against weaker players who are going to be paying us off more often if we do hit. And it's nice that the ace is out as well, because if one of these weaker players does have ace-x, they're going to get married to that top pair quite a lot and pay us off. So as you can see, when you compare these two examples, there's going to be stark differences in the realistic implied odds. We always want to be thinking about that when we're in the hand. And the last point I'll make here regarding this leak is that we really just want to get used to folding quote-unquote strong hands on the flop multi-way. Now, by strong hands, I don't mean good top pairs or strong draws, of course, but I mean hands that maybe in the past you had a bit of an urge to chase down, even though you knew they were kind of marginal. If you can get used to just getting in the habit of folding them right away on the flop, not wasting the mental energy, not wasting the chips, not getting caught out on later streets and making big mistakes, it's really going to save you a ton long term. It's going to save you a ton of mental energy. You're going to have a much more solid game. And you're not going to be one of the players who just constantly ends up at the river with the second best hand. So that's been it for this video. Hopefully you guys have enjoyed it. And this has been Mariano5 for Raise Your Edge.